So I have the pleasure of introducing Zach today. I jumped at this opportunity. I've known Zach for a long time, so I thought this would be really kind of fun to do. Don't worry, there's no incriminating pictures. So Zach has a really interesting background, so I'm gonna go over some of it. So first of all, he has a bachelor's in physics, and I really want to read the title of his undergraduate thesis, which is How to Simulate Quantum Physics on a Quantum Computer Using a Quantum Lattice Gas on a Non-Uniformly Quantized Space. So
all the cues were lined up.
I think that we can safely assume he knows how to count. He then went on to do his PhD in biophysics at Harvard, which is where I met him. And his thesis title was Optimality Principles for the Visual Code. He worked in Marcus Meister's laboratory. I did find out, and I won't disclose some details of this, I did find out in between those two things, he managed to get himself arrested, and none other than Ashford Prince bailed him out.
This is all true?
Just like that.
All true.
And I don't think we'll talk about it further. So he went on to do his PhD at Harvard, and it was work with Marcus Meister, very strong experimental lab working in the retina. Zach has a very strong interest, as you'll see today, in theory, so it was a really perfect pairing. Did great work. I had the pleasure of serving on his thesis committee. And
you were the only one to give me real comments.
So he said at some point that he thought I was the only person who read his thesis. I wanted to also point out that I still have his thesis.
Wow.
Okay, so
Wow.
many years later, and what I would
That's
do in
impressive.
those days is when my laboratory first got started, I would often take his thesis and put it down and say, okay, so there's the bar. Because it was a fantastic job as a PhD student working on optimality principles in vision. He went on from there to, by the way, in those days he had long dreadlocks, as I recall. He went on from there to Columbia, where he was postdoctoral fellow in the Center for Theoretical Neuroscience, working with Ken Miller, and probably it's a very collaborative environment there. He worked with lots of people. Then the University of Rochester, postdoc work with Alex Pouget and Greg D'Angelo, as many of us know. Just doing fantastic work, and then was secured by Rice and Baylor in 2013, where he's an assistant professor, and he's the co-director, in neuroscience and in electrical engineering, so I think he covers a lot of us here. And then he's the co-director for the Center for Neuroscience and Artificial Intelligence. He's a fantastic guy. He has strong interest in music and arts. That's not the science, but I think they blend together at some level. And I had the pleasure of visiting his house a year ago or so, and his house is exploding with musical instruments. So I think that tells you a little bit of his scientific interest in optimality, uncertainty, the world we live in, but he is not uncertain about what he wants to do. So I'll turn it over to Zach.
Thanks, Garrett. That was an amazing introduction. Can you come to every one of my talks? Thank you all for coming, and thank you for the invitation. It's a real pleasure to be here, and I've had an awesome set of meetings already today, and I think there's another couple coming up. So I'm going to talk to you today about a project thinking about nonlinear population codes, and this is some work that I've done with two students, Qianli Yang and Kaushik Lakshmi Narasimhan. So let's get going. So I'm going to talk about a few different concepts, and we're going to weave them together. And at the end, I'll give you guys something which I hope is a useful result for actual experiments in neuroscience. So we're going to talk about nonlinear computation, which I think is a really fundamental property of brain computations. We're going to talk about population codes. We're going to talk about noise, in particular, the kind that limits information in the brain. And we'll talk a little bit about what it means to have an equivalence class of decoders, which is, I think, a very important, relevant level of understanding and thinking about the brain. And in the end, we'll have a test for optimal nonlinear decoding. Okay, so let's begin with nonlinear computation. So we start with the premise that stimulus variables that we care about, the things we can act upon, are highly nonlinear functions of our sensory data. These are all highly tangled together. And the purpose of the brain, one of the purposes, is to untangle them from our sensory input so that we can separate them with simple operations, like just deciding whether You have, you're on this side or that side of a plane. Linear computation in the end. So just to illustrate the power of this kind of computation and nonlinear computation, I'll give you a very difficult quiz. You have to separate the yellow dots from the blue dots with one straight line. How do you do it? All right, good. You get an A+. How about, there's your solution. How about those dots? Separate the yellow from the blue with one straight line. Straight line. All right, I just took away your A+. How do you separate these with one straight line?
Are they all the same depth?
Ooh, that's devious. Well, now they're not. So if you apply, you can't do it as stated, but if you bend them into another dimension non-linearly, now how can you separate them? Yeah, you have a horizontal line, right? So this shows you that you can take a computation that's not achievable with linear computation, and you can do nonlinear transformations and then solve the same problem with a linear classifier at the end. So you can think that this is one of the reasons we have a big brain, is to do a lot of folding, a lot of nonlinear bending. So here's another classic task that requires nonlinear computation. In fact, this task killed perceptrons for like 30 years. It's the XOR problem. This is a different problem. Okay. The XOR problem, you have to give a 1 if you have X or Y being true, but not both. Okay? Now, the usual view of this, and we want to understand how do X and Y together encode Z. And the usual view is a kind of deterministic view. You have your X, you have your Y. You take a nonlinear function of X and Y, and then that will give you your answer. And what I want to propose today, that's fine, but I want to propose today a different way of viewing this, which is very useful for thinking about population codes. And that is a statistical view, where the thing that encodes Z are actually the noise correlations between X and Y. So the joint distribution of X and Y given Z is, is changing depending on Z. So if Z is 1, then X and Y are anti-correlated. And if Z is 0, then X and Y are positively correlated. They'll both be 0 or they'll both be 1. Okay? So these two can be viewed as equivalent, but it can be useful to think of this in the statistical view when you have lots and lots of neurons that are doing things, and you can try to take statistics to figure out what is the code. So when we talk about noise correlations, we have to define noise. What is noise? For me, noise is anything that you don't want to hear. So maybe this slide would count as noise for you if you don't like this definition. So that could be a few things. It could be internal noise. There's stochastic variability in the neurons. You might have some deterministic chaotic dynamics. You might have some internal network states, like am I hungry, am I tired? These things are noise with respect to other computations. And you also have, I think crucially, external noise, which is nuisance variables. That's another name for this. Things that are irrelevant to the task in the world, but that vary and affect your sensory information. So let me give you one example of a nuisance variable. This is the worst carpet choice for a stairway in the history of stairways. So why is this bad? This is bad because the actionable variable is where to step, and the nuisance variable is just the texture, the surface texture on this. And yeah, it's very easy to think that you're stepping on something which is texture, but you're actually stepping over the stair. So yeah, that's a really bad nuisance variable. But these things are everywhere. We're always dealing with nuisance variables. Every time we go to pick up a cup, the lighting is different, the position is different. Every time we go talk to somebody, they might have different clothes on. You put on a hat, now your hearing is changed. These things are all nuisance variables that we have to somehow disentangle. Okay, so that's a core function of the brain, is to get rid of these nuisance variables so you can act. Now we're going to talk about population codes. So here's one way to think about population codes. I think of coding in terms of these 3 overlapping processes. Biopointer. Okay, we have encoding, recoding, and decoding. And they're overlapping. These are not exclusive. So encoding is when you're looking at a neuron and you're relating it to the sensory stimulus, the external world. Decoding is when you're looking at a neuron, maybe these neurons. Oh, it's okay. I can reach the top, but thank you. It's cute though. Decoding is when you're relating the neural activity to the choices or actions of the agent, the animal. And recoding is in between, when you're transforming information that's been encoded in one way here, it's now encoded in a different way there. Or it was decoded with this whole sequence there, and now it's decoded with a subset of those transformations. Okay, so I would like to understand these three overlapping processes. I think that's one of the core functions of theory in neuroscience. So we're going to start by simplifying this problem and not addressing directly the nonlinear population codes yet. But first, we'll just introduce some concepts from linear population codes. So here, we imagine we have a stimulus. We have some neurons that care about that stimulus. And then somehow, maybe ... those neurons are decoded linearly to give you a behavioral choice, which we could say is an estimate of the stimulus that is used to drive an action. So if you have a linear decoder, you have your neurons up top, and then you take a weighted sum to get your linear readout here. All right, so we can view the effective decoding weights as W. You take the inner product between W and your responses, and you call that your choice. It's a continuous choice. This is your estimate, S hat, of the stimulus. So now let's think about the population code. Okay, so here I'm going to draw this in many dimensions, but really just two, because two is easy. Each axis is going to be the response of one neuron. And so now, as you have a stimulus that traces out, let's say we have a scalar stimulus, it traces out some kind of curve in this population response space. This is the mean response of all of the neurons in your population as a function of the stimulus S. And so you pick one S, you're going to get 1 point here. Of course, the brain doesn't get a single point. The brain gets a whole bunch of points at different times because of noise. You never get the same exact response reliably. So we can characterize that by some kind of covariance. This is the next order approximation. And of course, the structure can be more complicated, but we'll just use the covariance. And so the covariance of the response given the stimulus, we're going to call that the noise covariance, and we'll call that Q. So this Q, this noise, is one of the things that makes it hard to figure out what's actually there when you're a brain and you have your neural responses. So if we want to decode that information, we have to disambiguate how much noise there is from how much signal. So if we change the signal, let's say we're doing a local discrimination task. So we know that there's a reference here, and we're going to change the stimulus a little bit, maybe left or maybe right. And so the direction that we care about is this derivative of the tuning curve. This is the tuning curve, this population tuning curve here. This is the derivative of it. So it's your sensitivity. That's the signal. And then we already talked about the noise. So the signal points in some direction. Now, how are we going to extract the signal in the presence of the noise? Well, in this linear code, we're going to do a readout. And the readout is another vector in this space. And so it can point in different directions, and different choices have different quality. So here, this is kind of a bad choice, because this choice of reading out, if you project onto this axis here, this gives you the most noise you could possibly get. And yes, you get a good chunk of the signal, but there's more noise than signal. So your signal to noise ratio is not great. But if we project that noise onto that axis, like that, then we'll get some distribution of possible decoded estimates. And the width of that distribution is something we could call the threshold, theta. Right, there's your threshold. And this is how much do you have to shift your stimulus by to beat the noise. That's what the threshold is. Okay, so if you shift your stimulus by that much, now you're one standard deviation away, and that means you're going to make a mistake like less than 1 minus 68% of the time, if it's a Gaussian. So we can shift it to make sure that we only make a binary error 75% of the time. That's arbitrary thing. The key thing is it scales with the width of this noise distribution projected into the readout. Now, what if we picked a different readout direction? So let's pick this direction. Now, we're going to get maybe a little bit less signal, but we're going to get even less of the noise. So this is a better direction. This is actually, in this case, the optimal direction. And so you'll have a smaller threshold, which is the same as more information, more discriminability. Okay? Does this make sense? By the way, I'm very happy to have interruptions. Just ask away, and we can discuss these things at greater depth as needed. I like interactivity. Okay, so yes, good.
So is theta your decoder threshold? That's independent of the projection of the signal onto
No, it
So
depends.
you normalize
It depends on which projection you picked, right? So this threshold is smaller. The threshold from before was wider because you were getting more of the noise. And if you want to, what you should do is put it in units of sensitivity. The whole thing should be in units of S, in units of the stimulus. So to make it unbiased, there are some mathematical things that you do to describe the threshold in units of stimulus.
I didn't get when you said that this is the optimal.
Well, it just happens for this particular noise covariance in this particular signal direction. The optimal one we'll get to in a second, the mathematics of it. Okay. Okay, so if we'd like to know something about that readout, that is, in this linear model, that is the decoder. And we'd like to understand the decoder, that is how the brain uses its information. So how can we learn about that? Well, one thing that people have measured in the past have been what they've called choice probabilities. But a much simpler way of thinking about it is just choice correlations. This is the correlation between a neuron and the choice of the animal. And here the choice is a continuous choice, so we can put it in quotes. But this is just an affine transformation from choice probability. It's the same thing if you're more familiar with choice probability. This really essentially no different. Now, the reason that it's nice to think about correlations between neurons and choices, you can imagine if you have a neuron that's highly correlated with your choice, that suggests that that neuron is maybe influencing the choice. But it doesn't have to be that way. Instead, it could be an indirect effect. This neuron could be correlated with the choice because it's correlated with another neuron, and the other neuron is causing the choice. So just looking at choice correlations alone will not tell you whether the neuron is decoded. And you can see that in this equation where I'm just using the expression for a correlation coefficient, which is covariance divided by the standard deviations. So here's your covariance. This is the covariance of the noise, and this is the projection of that through the decoder weights. And so we can see where this shows up because, and then this is just standard deviations. This is the covariance if we assume zero means of everything. So we just take that the estimate that the choice is a linear readout W times the response vector, all of the neurons, and we plug it into here. Then we get WR times RK, and then we take the average, right? The W pops out because it's not random, and then we just get the average of R times R, and the kth component of that, and that's what gives us the Q. So W times Q, and then we take the kth component of that. That's the covariance between the choice and the neuron. So that goes into this top here. Now, okay, that's a general form no matter what decoder you use. What if you do a good job? If you do a good job, a good linear decoder, the best linear decoder, and this gets at your question, is to take the inverse covariance times the sensitivity. This is just linear regression, right? You take the inverse of the correlation in the input, and then you multiply it by the covariance between the stimulus and the response. And so you can see that another way of thinking about this is you have some sensitivity, and if all the noise were independent in all the directions, then you would just say, well, the best decoder is going to be lying along the direction that the signal lives, right? So that when the stimulus moves along, your picking up that direction. Well, but now the noise is different in different directions. So if you first whiten and then you do this decoding that same way, then that gives you another interpretation of this same formula. And it's proportional because the proportionality makes sure that you're unbiased. So now we have this simple expression for optimal decoding. It's just a vector of weights. And we can substitute that in to that expression for the correlation between neuron and choice and see what happens. So this is for the optimal decoder. The covariance in the top, I'm going to plug in for W. There it is. W is equal to Q inverse times the sensitivity. Remember, Q is the covariance. And now the Q and the Q inverse cancel. So that part goes away, and you're left with just the sensitivity of that neuron divided by the standard deviation. Right? That's what this thing is. And this is just the threshold. This is how much do you have to change the stimulus by to beat the noise for that one neuron. So we can call that 1 over the threshold, but now this is the threshold just for one neuron at a time. Okay? And we still have this proportionality here. If we fix the proportionality, then it turns out it's the ratio of the threshold of the whole animal to the threshold of that neuron. And if the animal is doing optimal linear decoding, then the correlations between choice and neurons should be equal to the fraction of information that that neuron has. Right? This is we can write this in a bunch of different ways. Sometimes people are more familiar with D prime. This is D prime. Square root of Fisher information is proportional to D prime. J is the Fisher information. So if you're optimal, if you're doing optimal readout, and this is critical, then the choice correlation that you get, that you would measure in an experiment, is the fraction of information that that neuron has compared to the animal. Okay? Population threshold divided by neural threshold, or neural information divided by population information. In other words, neurons predict choices better if they have good information. It makes a lot of sense, right? You don't want to decode a neuron that has really crappy information. You only want to decode the good neurons. And the Q inverse up here takes into consideration all of the covarying fluctuations of all the neurons. Now, one problem with this, which is a major conflict with the experiment, seemingly, is that current models of population codes suggest that if you have a lot of neurons, you have a lot of information. And that means that if you look at just one neuron in a million, then it should have a tiny little influence over the choice. And yet, when you go and measure in the brain to see how much correlation a neuron has with the choice, it's really significant. It's not a tiny little effect. You can find neurons that have a correlation of 0.2 with a choice. This is one neuron with the behavior of an entire animal. You can find neurons in some brain areas, and this was not like muscle pushing a button. You can find sensory neurons that have correlations of 0.5, 0.6, 0.7 with the choice. These are really big correlations. And you would not get that from optimal decoding if you had a ton of information distributed across many neurons. Does that make sense, that conflict? Any questions here?
Is it optimal encoding or optimal decoding?
Optimal decoding. I'm not going to talk about quality of encoding here. I'm going to talk about, here's the neurons you have, this is what you do with them.
Right.
And you could have done potentially better if you just dedicated all of your neurons to this one task, but that's not what the animal does. I mean, we're putting it in a weird lab environment and asking it to do these very unnatural tasks in many cases.
Can you just say a few more words about why it's so surprising to have high correlations between individual neurons with a task variable if there are no constraints on the encoding being particularly efficient? Because if the neurons have a tremendous amount of redundancy, right?
That's going to be the solution. That's exactly the solution.
Okay.
Yeah, and I'm going to talk about that now.
Sorry.
Yeah, but the current models that people have of population codes they're not redundant. They're extensive. So if you have more neurons, you have more information. And so if you have, a ton of neurons in your cortex, according to these models, which are wrong, then you should have a ton of information. And these are estimable names of people who are modeling these populations. So I don't think that that model is right. And the reason is that these neurons, as Chris just said, that these neurons are redundant. And so I'm going to talk about this in a section about information limiting noise, which I'll sometimes call informally bad noise. Okay, so the reason is basically, why are these redundant? You have a few sensory neurons that project into a much larger cortex. And that means that any noise that you have here also projects into the much larger cortex. And you can't get new information about the external world just by having more neurons here, because they all inherit from the same signals. If you have a bigger stimulus, then you have more neurons tuned to the orientation, let's say, or the direction. And a smaller stimulus, you'd have fewer neurons. So that information is limited already at the periphery, at your retina, whatever your initial noise is in your sensory neurons. You can't improve beyond that. You can process, you can filter, but you can't create information. You can reformat, but not create it. Okay, so if you have some noise covariance at your input here, and you process your signals with some transformation A, then over here you're going to have at least the noise covariance, which is AEA transpose, which is just transforming the noise covariance through the same thing. And so now, when you reach a decision, you're basing that decision on redundant neurons, neurons that have just many copies of the same sensory input. So if you look at the consequence of inheriting information from a smaller sensory population, instead of having information grow with your population size, it comes up and then saturates. And it saturates to, at most, the level that's given by your input population. And so there was some early work thinking about this in very simple models, and then we have a paper which looked at this in the general case. So let me give you an intuition for what this bad noise looks like. How many people here know who this is? Okay, this is Waldo. And for some reason, people find it amusing to play the game Where's Waldo? I don't understand this game, but somewhere in this picture is Waldo. And people publish books about this, and people buy those books, and then they go and try to find Waldo, right? So where's Waldo? There's Waldo. I can't even see him in there because the resolution is too poor. But it illustrates the challenge here. Why is this hard? Because a lot of the things that are distracting look like pieces of Waldo. You have stripes in the towels. You have a lot of people wearing blue jeans, and there's your blue jeans Waldo guy. So if you have bad noise, this is noise that looks like Waldo. There's no way, if you have all these copies of Waldo, to figure out which one is the true Waldo, because the noise looks just like the signal. Sometimes they talk about referring the noise back to the input. This is noise referred back to the input. Then you have other noise, which is not so bad. I mean, you can see where Waldo is. Maybe it's harder to figure out how many fingers Waldo is holding up, because the noise may look like a change in the number of fingers. So what is bad for one task might be not so bad for another task. But that's what bad noise is. So if we have redundant populations, then there are two reasons why you might be able to get a high correlation with the choice. One is that you have these neurons are correlated, and so you're reading out a different neuron, and lots of the neurons are all correlated with the read out neurons. That's one possible reason. Another reason is maybe you don't have so much redundancy, but you're just doing a really crappy job. So you're only reading out one neuron or a handful of neurons, and if you had pooled from more neurons, you would have averaged away more noise. Or maybe it's both. That's also possible. So we derive the consequences of it being both. So you might have suboptimal decoding and limited information. And it turns out that you can derive this formula for the choice correlation, which is that the measured choice correlation should be a weighted sum of the optimal choice correlation, which I showed you previously, and some other factor, which is the suboptimal choice correlation. And this one depends on your specific suboptimal decoder. So there's detail that goes into this. This one is generic for any optimal decoder. And the weighting coefficients here, yes, that square root is correct. It's very counterintuitive. You'd expect alpha and 1 minus alpha, but that's not the way it is. Alpha is the efficiency of this computation. So it's the fraction of uncertainty that's limited by noise rather than suboptimality. And so if you're curious about that, we can talk about that later. We took this equation and we applied it to data. And I'm just going to flash that graph on here briefly, because what I want to get to next is the nonlinear stuff. So here is, this is data from a bunch of monkeys where we were recording during a vestibular discrimination task. So the monkeys are in a chair, they're being moved forward and a little left or right, and they have to say whether it was a little left or right. And so that gives them information. We record from their brains, and we measure how well the choice correlations that we measure while they perform the task are matched to the optimal prediction versus a suboptimal prediction. And in the earlier sensory areas, we were finding that things looked pretty close to having an alpha of 1, which means that you're close to consistent with near optimal decoding. That was too many waffles. You are consistent with near optimal decoding. Close to consistent with almost near maybe. And these different brain areas, there was some very interesting stuff that we saw in VIP. This doesn't mean more than optimal. This actually means suboptimal in a very specific way, but I don't have time to talk about it today. You can ask me afterward. Yeah, Astrid.
Can you say how these monkey areas correspond to V1 and V2 and
So this is the vestibular nucleus or the cerebellar nucleus. So this is early stuff. And then this is the medial superior temporal cortex, dorsal part, which is responsive to optic flow and vestibular inputs. And this is like LIP, but for vestibular system, ventral intraparietal. So this is early, mid, and late sensory processing. Okay, so now I want to talk about, I mean, this is cool. This is in a published paper. You can check it out. You can destroy it if you like. Now I want to talk about nonlinear computation. So all that stuff that I just talked about is great if you're recording from the neurons that are linearly decoded by the brain to make a decision. But what if you're recording from these neurons? Well, now there's a lot of stuff between here and the decision. And we'd like to understand that. So that's where the action is, that kind of recoding. Now we're going to talk about nonlinear population codes. So let me give you a simple kind of schematic illustration of how we can think about this. So we have some variable that you care about, z. And in the end, you'd like to estimate z and act upon z through some z hat. But you don't get to sense z directly. Instead, you get x and y, and you can sense x and y separately, but their product is z. So now you have separate neuron populations that are tuned to x and tuned to y. And so one way is that you could decode the responses from your x neurons and y neurons to give you an estimate of x and an estimate of y, and then multiply those estimates together to give you some estimate of z. Okay, that's one way that you could do it. Now, the problem with that is that this is very much a grandmother cell type of representation. If I lost that cell because I had too much to drink last night, now I can't do the task at all, right? And this is one of the reasons why people don't like grandmother cell representations. But we don't have to do the multiplication out here. We can do the multiplication earlier. So we take our two populations, and now we multiply all of those populations in like an outer product, let's say. And we define a new population, which I'll call capital R, which is a nonlinear transformation of my little r's. And so rx times ry. And then I can linearly decode this big R. And just a simple mapping shows that this decoding, a linear decoding of the big R, is the same as decoding the little r and the other little r and then multiplying them. Right? And it also tells us, of course, what the weights should be. These weights should be basically the outer product of the weights from each decoder separately. So now this is a fully distributed nonlinear computation. This was nonlinear also, but only after you've sort of extracted relevant stimulus variables. This is nonlinear in the populations themselves. Make sense? So what does this look like at the population level? Well, before, when we were dealing with linear codes, we can imagine that the mean was shifting along this curve here, this tuning curve. And so then the noise was something that made it hard to figure out where you were on the tuning curve, but at least you were moving there. In a purely nonlinear code, the mean isn't going to shift. The mean for all these different stimuli will be in the same place. And what will differ is the noise conditioned on that stimulus. Okay, so what was noise now counts as signal. And this is a covariance, a noise covariance, that depends on S. So here we have a covariance that's dependent on S. And if it's a continuous variable, you can imagine that that covariance would kind of rotate or scale around. And that's where you would get your information from. The mean is not relevant anymore in a nonlinear, purely nonlinear population code. Now you can have both. You can have linear and nonlinear components. But I'm going to emphasize the purely nonlinear parts, because those are the parts that are important for nuisance transformations. So this is one way where you can get a stimulus-dependent covariance. And it shows up not because of internal noise, but because of external noise, nuisance variation. So here are two stimuli. These are oriented Gabors that are rotating through, and the spatial phase is changing. Okay? So these 2 points are corresponding to the spatial phase. As you shift the spatial phase around, you're going to trace out in your response of neurons 1 and neurons 2, which I'll explain in a second, that spatial phase causes their mean to shift around. Now these two neurons, I'm imagining that they are just linear neurons with some Gabor receptive field. So you just take the Gabor overlap with this guy, and that's neuron 1, and another overlap of the image with its receptive field for neuron 2. And now as you change the spatial phase of your input, you're going to trace out these ellipses. Okay, so now if you can see that the mean over all possible spatial phases is going to be 0, or in the middle here, no matter what spatial phase you, no matter what orientation you pick. Now you can imagine, well, I see what the spatial phase is, and so I can try to decode the spatial phase. But if you're looking for how do I decode these neurons, how do I figure out what they're tuned to, and I do this many, many times, the tuning to the stimulus of interest, which is orientation, is 0. Because half the time I've seen a plus value, like over here, half the time I've seen another spatial phase over here. And on average, there's just no tuning of these neurons. No direct linear mean tuning. So that covariance is going to change. The covariance between these two responses is going to change in the orientation, whether you're yellow or blue. Yeah?
So you're showing this, so if you were to have done this through multiplication instead of the real space, you would have done this by doing a linear transform, doing it in the Fourier space, then the angle would have showed up very nicely.
Oh, no, only if you took the modulus.
Oh, that's right, only if you take the modulus, that's right.
Yeah, so again, nonlinear computation. Yeah. So this is what happens if you now look just at the tuning of the covariance for a fixed spatial phase. Okay, so these two neurons, you're getting these ellipses represent the covariance of all possible spatial phases, and you have the yellow dot and the blue dot. You see them up on the ellipses? It's the same exact system as before, but now I'm fixing the phase and rotating the orientation. You see that the covariances rotate. This is what the tuning curve looks like now as a function of orientation. This is the covariance of R1 and R2. It's kind of a cool, twisty covariance. But this is the nonlinear analog of a tuning curve. I showed you a tuning curve to a scalar stimulus for one neuron. This is the same thing for a pair of neurons where the mean doesn't change, but only the covariance. I like this picture. You guys like this picture? That's what I want to tie up my ribbons, my presents with. So let me try to make a mathematical analogy to help interpret this notion of a nonlinear population code. So linear population code, all the information about the stimulus can be extracted locally as a linear function of neural responses. And this is what we had before, right? When is that good? Well, that's good when your responses, given the stimulus, come from an exponential family distribution with linear sufficient statistics. That is, if I tell you R, then I can tell you the posterior directly as a linear weighting of R. And it's going to be just different S's, but that means that you weight the R's in different ways. But it's linear in R. And the Fisher information is the linear Fisher information. It's the sensitivity. This is Fisher information. Just think of it as a signal-to-noise ratio. It's the signal power, so that's like f prime squared. Remember, f prime is the linear signal, divided by the noise power, and that's Q inverse. So this is a signal-to-noise ratio in R. Okay, make sense? This is, there's a lot of math sort of behind this, but I want to give you a general flavor. Now we're going to change this to nonlinear population codes. And the only thing that happens is that little r is going to go to big R. Everything else is the same. So now, in order to estimate the stimulus, you have to linearly read out the sufficient statistics big R under the condition that your exponential family has these big R sufficient statistics. And the Fisher information is nonlinear Fisher information. So the sensitivity is the sensitivity of the average of big R. Before it was the average of little r, now it's the average of big R. And the noise is the covariance of big R. So let's be more concrete. Let's do the quadratic version, which is like when the covariance changes. Now, in order to read out what the stimulus is, you need to read out R transpose, which is the sufficient statistic for the covariance. Here we have a covariance. This thing is a Gaussian, right? E to the some function times R squared. That's a Gaussian with a constant mean. So that's one example of a purely quadratic code. And the Fisher information is the quadratic Fisher information, also known as the trace term for those aficionados amongst you. So let me do one more set of parallels, because I think that this hammers it home even better. So in the linear case, the signal was the change in the mean, right? Here's your mean. The prime is the change. This is how sensitive is your mean response to the signal, right? So f prime to the stimulus. F prime is the signal. The noise is the covariance of the response. That's Q. And then your signal-to-noise ratio is just the squared ratio of these two. It's f prime squared divided by Q. Yeah? And on one trial, you don't get the mean, right? What do you get? You get your response R. So what do you read out? You read out R. Now we're going to go to the quadratic code, nonlinear code. So now the signal is not in the mean, but it's in the covariance. So this is the average of R transpose. That's the covariance. And the sensitivity of that covariance is your signal now. The sensitivity of R squared. And the noise, the covariance of R squared, this is a fourth order quantity. That covariance is now your noise. It's a fourth order statistic. And your signal to noise ratio is signal divided by noise, once again. What do you read out? You don't get a covariance every time you see the stimulus. You only get one response. The thing that you read out is R transpose. You read out the products of these neural activities to get your single trial estimate of the covariance. Just the way that you would read out what your neural responses to get a single trial estimate of the mean, you read out products to get a single trial estimate of your covariance. So I'll pause here for a minute. So I think that this is kind of a fundamental way of thinking about nonlinear population codes. Yeah?
So this does this imply that somewhere this R transpose is being computed by population?
Sort of. We'll come back to that at the end. Okay, but I think that's also a very fundamental question. Is this going to be explicit, or is it going to be implicit?
Well, this is for quadratic.
Yeah.
And I'm having a hard time generalizing this.
Just replace this by big R, any function you like. If it's in the exponential family with nonlinear sufficient statistics, this is what you would get. And then you read out big R. In the quadratic case, you read out big R is equal to R transpose. So this is the more general case. Now, there's no guarantee. In fact, I'm sure that we're not in the exponential family with nonlinear sufficient statistics. We're not in the exponential family at all, because in exponential family, the more data that you collect, the number of sufficient statistics you have remains constant. It characterizes the distribution, and then you just collect more data about it. But in the real world, our world here, the more you look, the more you find. And that means you're out of this family. Still, it's probably a good approximation, at least for many tasks that we care about. One more question, please.
Could you say something more about the decoder? It's a little locally nonlinear.
Yeah, so this is all based on sort of Fisher information type measures. You can generalize this to, instead of like local derivatives, you can take deltas in binary cases. Or if you want to go all the way back to, let's say, posterior estimations, then you have to look at the full exponential family distribution. Yeah, so many experimentalists deal with discrimination tasks. So despite the fact that I don't love them, I'm trying to help out. Okay, so now we're going to get to this optimality test. Okay, the optimality test for, in this case, let's say, an optimal quadratic code. Well, if we already transformed the right way to get big R, then we know from the linear part, we've linearized, now we can use the optimal test for the linear part that I said in the first half. So the choice correlation between this linear unit, which we've just constructed, and let's call it Rjk, which is just the product of Rj times Rk, then that thing should be the threshold for the animal divided by the threshold for that unit that we just created. But we can now substitute in what we imagine that Rjk to be. It's a product of two neurons that we're measuring. We're not measuring this neuron. This is somewhere else, maybe in the brain. These are neurons that we're actually looking at. And we can now substitute that in to make this new quantity, new statistic. It's called, we're calling it a nonlinear choice correlation. And it's in this case, the quadratic code, it's a third order statistic. It's Rj times Rk times S hat. And we have the same formula. It's just the threshold for the animal divided by the threshold for that product, for that particular pair. And you can do this a lot of times for lots of different products of neurons that you recorded from in your population and see whether this equation holds. So let's imagine in a simple toy model, here we have a linear decoder, and we're going to calculate choice correlations, both linear and nonlinear. And here we have a nonlinear decoder that's using quadratics, and we'll see what happens there. So first, let's calculate the conventional choice correlation between Ri and S hat. And so in this simple case, we're going to get a peak for this, which says, yeah, your neurons are correlated with the choice, and that's awesome. And in this nonlinear decoder, nope, they're not correlated with the choice. They're all kind of randomly concentrated around 0 with no significance here at all. Now let's calculate the nonlinear choice correlation. Over here, we're looking at pairs of neurons and looking at how well they correlate with the choice at the end. And we get a big peak over here because those neurons are actually being multiplied to get the choice. Whereas over here, you get this wide distribution, again, insignificant, centered on 0, because this is not a nonlinear decoder.
Does this imply that you know the nature of the nonlinearity? I mean, if it were some arbitrary nonlinearity, then you would not.
Okay, so this is a really important question. You don't need to know the true nonlinearity. If it's optimal, this should work for every sufficient statistic that you have. If you did it with linear, they would be at 0, but there would also be 0 information. So it would be 0 correlation with the choice and 0 correlation with the stimulus, i.e. 0 information. And so it would still be consistent with optimal nonlinear decoding. But some of the statistics you might pick are just uninformative about both ways. So now we have the same question as before. If we have now we have n squared products, doesn't that mean we have tons of information? And again, the current models of nonlinear population codes, of which there's really basically one, it's the same one in both these cases, it implies that the information grows with the nonlinear information grows with the number of neurons. And that definitely doesn't happen for the same reasons as before, because you inherit information from a limited input. So if you have m inputs and you consider all the possible combinations, like cubic combinations, you have m squared, m cubed, there's potentially a lot of these. But now expand that into the cortex and now do all the possible combinations. This is just completely prohibitive, right? There's no way to get n cubed if you have tons and tons of these guys. But the nice thing is that it's okay because information limiting correlations mean that you don't need to decode all of those things. And what do information limiting correlations look like in a nonlinear code? Well, if you have some input space, this is your sensory input. This represents your 2 sensors, let's say. And you have some noise associated with that, which gives you a discretization that you cannot distinguish. Now, if you map that information into the cortex in this nonlinear way, there's this kind of curved manifold, the noise balls also map nonlinearly. So you preserve the discretization if this is an invertible mapping. And so you can see that these noise blobs or these noise squares get elongated. And so that means that when you can't get more information out from all of these expanded nonlinear functions, like all the R cubes that you might imagine, they're not all informative. How many are informative? Well, as many as were informative in your sensory input. So if n is bigger than m, all you need is m linear neurons, m squared quadratic products, and m cubed cubic products. And you'll get all of the information that there is in the input space.
You said that it was necessary it's invertible. Is that an important sort of?
Well, if you don't have it invertible, then you'll lose some of the information. But you can have it non-invertible for that neuron and have a different neuron cover that part of space. So as long as the whole thing is transformed, you can of course throw away information. You can't create more. So now if we look at this choice correlation thing, where we're measuring the nonlinear choice correlation, and we're comparing it to this optimal choice correlation, this theoretical prediction, here I'm picking something which is not quite optimal. This is something that's not aware of all the structure in this model brain. And we don't follow this diagonal line, which is the measured choice correlation does not equal theta over theta jk. But if there's bad noise, now it brings that suboptimal decoder much closer to optimal. And so here we have evidence that it's essentially near optimal decoding. And we see this kind of cluster around the identity here, where the optimal choice correlation is closely matched by the measure. And this would happen whenever you have enough limited information, when you're redundant enough that your suboptimality is not so bad. So I'm going to show you a data slide now. This is data from Valentin Dragoy's lab, where he looked at monkeys that were discriminating between two natural images that were rotated. And we measured the nonlinear choice correlations here for 2 different animals, monkey 1 and monkey 2, blue and yellow, and in area V1 and area V4. And we get a lot of scatter here, but there's a blob that's elongated, and that elongation has a slope near 1. So this is some evidence that monkeys in this task are using informative correlations, like the neurons' correlations depend on the stimulus, and they're using that in driving their behavioral choice. And that's why we see this correlation here between the x and y axes, which I just want to mention is a correlation between correlations of correlations. So one final little concept that I want to introduce real quickly to address some of these questions, and I think an important concept in how we think about population codes. That's the notion of equivalent nonlinearities. So if we have a stimulus and then a bunch of neural responses, those neural responses can be decoded in many equivalent ways. If you have 2 neurons that basically carry the same information, you could read out number 1, or you could read out number 2, or you could read out their average, or anything in between. Do we really care which way it goes? I think what we care about is which kind of information is extracted. And so here, this is like a little toy model where we have the neurons, and there's a true neural nonlinearity here that gets read out. But we're recording from these neurons, and we make some proxy nonlinear neurons downstream, which are linear, quadratic, and cubic, let's say. This is like a third-order Taylor series approximation. And each one of these populations, these virtual populations, is themselves redundant, just like that brain part. And so now we can read out the best guess for the stimulus from population 3, the cubics, the quadratics, the linears. And there are many equivalent ways to do that because of the redundancy inherent in the code when the code inherits from a limited sensory population. So the fine details of how you get that information out, I think that's not so relevant. What is relevant is how much the brain weighs the cubic versus quadratic versus linear information. So these thin lines here, there are some weights on them. And those are the essential properties of the transformation that the brain is using. And I think that that's the target that we want to understand. This defines an equivalence class of nonlinear computations that washes out a lot of the detail in the decoding of each population, but preserves some essential features that we deem important. And so if you think about, to get to your question from before, do you need to calculate the R squared? Well, no. You could calculate an R squared as a sum of rectified linear units, right? Every time you add a new unit with a different threshold, the slope increases. And if you do it with uniformly distributed thresholds, you get a quadratic. And then you flip it over the other side, you get the full quadratic. So you don't have to do an R squared explicitly. You could just take a weighted sum of threshold linear units, which are nonlinear, right? And get the same answer. And that's fine. I don't think we care exactly whether it's done this way or with a quadratic. What we care about is what is the information that's there. So defining that mathematically remains an important challenge, but I think that it's a challenge that we need to confront. So these are the things that I want you to take home, your mementos. There are such things as nonlinear population codes, and that's when the stimulus is encoded in higher order statistics of neural responses, not just the means. Information is going to be limited in your brain because of the sensory population, and this is going to affect correlations of all orders. And we have a nonlinear choice correlation, which is a new statistic that we can use to test for optimal nonlinear computation. Maybe it'll work, maybe it won't in certain cases, but at least it's an important thing to check, whether the choice correlation of a statistic is matched by, is the fraction of information it contains about the stimulus. And finally, we need to grapple with this notion of an equivalence class of nonlinearities when you have a redundant code. So finally, thanks to the people who did this work with me, Qianli Yang and Kaushik Lakshminarasimhan, as well as my collaborators who thought about the information limiting stuff and the linear choice correlations, and also thanks to the funding agencies, and finally, thanks to you for your attention.
Time for questions. My question may be very high level and irrelevant, but you're assuming here that there is no predictive coding, that everything is happening in a feed-forward manner. Right?
That's correct, yeah.
Why do you assume?
I don't want to assume that, and we actually are working on recurrent networks that do similar things. In some cases, it doesn't make a difference at all. In other cases, it does, depending on, like, if what you care about are correlations between the activations that account for all of the recurrence, and that might be what gives it the properties that it has, like covariance and all of that, then it doesn't matter for decoding. The mechanism by which you get those activity patterns may not matter. If you then inactivate a brain region and that breaks the recurrence, or you turn off some cell types that breaks the recurrence, then that will tell you about how did that information get represented that way. And so that's going to be important. I think temporal dynamics is another reason why recurrence is very important. And in some other work that we're thinking about, how do you do real probabilistic inference in distributed population codes like this? The recurrent dynamics are the heart of the matter, not the feed-forward part. So people like Dan Yeamans are reporting in images that 50% is explained by feed-forward. That, for me, is the less interesting part. And who knows what happens during, the students and I were talking about this, what happens with that. In video, probably it's going to be less explained by the feed-forward component and more explained by the recurrence. We also have some thoughts on predictive coding and trying to unify predictive coding, efficient coding, and inference that I think would be important. But all of them require recurrent computation. Yeah.
So this is another high-level question. Why do you care if the decoding is optimal or not?
I care about principles. And if the brain is doing optimal computation, then that's a nice principle that we can lean on for other tasks. It's not going to be true in all tasks, and I know that it's not true in some tasks, especially laboratory tasks. But it's a nice way of testing the brain. Like if we don't have optimality as a benchmark, where are our theories going to come from?
So it's one thing to use it as a benchmark. It's another thing to claim that the brain is optimal. Right?
Yeah, exactly. And that's why we have to test it. So we provide a test, and that test may be falsified.
If the brain, if you see that the brain is close to optimal, or approaching to be close to approximately optimal, then does that tell you? Does that help you predict, for example, behavior?
Yeah, that can tell you. But then you can use ideal observer analysis. Then you can say, well, what is the brain? It also constrains what kind of computations you might expect to see. So, for example, if you look at some kind of, I don't know, let's just say concretely, some cubic computations, or you need to, back to the staircase, you need to integrate, you need to marginalize over the different texture patterns. Okay, now this is something that we can look for. How does the brain do that? You can ask questions about mechanism now that you know that it's doing the best that it can. It's still not easy, right? Because that mechanism, there may be many mechanisms consistent with the same kind of computation. And that's why, if you're going to go down that road, you need to think about equivalence classes of computations. So that's why I am driven to that.
I mean, that's where I'm sort of driving at it. Saying that, from my perspective, saying that the brain is optimal only helps you if you know what encoding is, so that and you know what the options are for decoding. But just if you don't have any of that information, saying that the brain is optimal doesn't give you anything. Right?
Well, you have the encoding because you're able to make the test, right? Like you have the neurons, they're there. You don't know exactly what the form is, but now you can study that encoding. But I want to emphasize again, I think this is in response to somebody else's question. Just because it's optimally decoded does not mean it's optimally encoded. You could do a really great job with some crappy input, or you could do a crappy job with some great input. And so you'd like to know both of those features, and those are different theories. You need to address both of them, and so different domains. Yeah, important.
So I was a little unclear as you sort of frame this, whether you view this as an optimal encoding and decoding strategy relative to the neural hardware and the neural constraints, or whether you think there's actually an optimal representation, information representation here that we can learn from to go do something in machine learning better. So are you thinking optimal relative specifically to neural encoding?
Yes.
Or do you think that there is some optimality principle about information representation that we could make a connection to our machine learning systems and do something better?
No.
Hardware driven.
I think, yeah, so this particular study, and we can talk about other ways of thinking about this, but that's not a decoding-centric view. This view is looking at what the brain does with what it has. And it's not evaluating the quality of what it has. So if you wanted to use this in machine learning, you'd have to say, well, is this a good representation? Yeah, the brain does everything that it can with that limited information, but the brain could have done better if it had just encoded better. This makes no claims about that. This is only what do you do with what you have.
I had a question. So you had a slide where you talked about the relative importance of one neuron among a million, and you cited studies where you say that in some cases there's a correlation of 0.2, for example, of activity of one neuron behavior. I'm wondering, to what extent do you think that's due to the simplicity of the behavioral tasks that we're asking of humans or animals during these kind of studies versus real life? Do you think, do you think real life decisions are going to boil down to sort of these neurons that are going to be very predictive, or do you think it's going to be some much more complicated distributed?
I suspect it's going to be much more complicated. I think this is kind of an artifact of super simple, no nuisance tasks. So if you're like in prefrontal cortex and you're thinking about different stuff and you have lots of context-based nuisance variables, I think that variation, that variability is going to be much higher, such that the part of the neuron that's correlated with behavior is small. That's my suspicion. So these are very low-level basic sensory tasks, and I do encourage everybody to start thinking about more naturalistic tasks, because I think the more naturalistic we can go, the more that we learn about the brain. I mean, the brain did not evolve to do 2 alternative forced choice tasks in this kind of context.
He says that as a theorist.
It's true. And we have learned a lot from 2 AFC tasks. I mean, I don't want to poo-poo that. That's been really helpful and important.
All right. Well, thanks for everyone.
Awesome. Good questions, everybody.